"Trust no one," he wrote. "Not even our children." The paper was cold in my hands, thin as a dead leaf. My husband of 55 years wrote those words hours before his heart finally gave out, and the silence he left behind was suddenly filled with a terrifying noise. What he was trying to warn me about was already in my house, smiling and offering condolences. Stay with me until the end to understand what happened next. Subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, whether it's from your city, from work, or even the comfort of your own couch. My name is Evelyn Prescott, and I am 78 years old. For most of those years, my hands have known the delicate language of silk and thread, restoring vintage gowns to their former glory in my small workshop here in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. This morning, however, they felt useless, resting heavy and cold in the lap of my black wool dress. Arthur was gone. The silence in our federal-style home was the first thing I noticed, not the comforting quiet of early morning, but a deep, hollow void where the sound of his breathing should have been. The air, thick with the scent of lilies from the endless bouquets in the hall, felt difficult to draw into my lungs. The drizzle outside had been relentless since dawn, tapping a somber rhythm on the slate roof and blurring the view of the cobblestone street below. I watched a single fat drop of rain trace a path down the antique window pane, and for a moment, I felt as lost as it was. My life had always been a series of predictable, gentle motions, waking to the chime of the North Church bells, tending to Arthur and his weakening heart, and the daily calls from our children. Robert, my pragmatic son, would call from his Boston law firm precisely at 9. Susan, my daughter, who lived just 10 minutes away, would call at 10, her voice always laced with a gentle, smothering concern. Today, they were here. Their hushed voices drifted up from the parlor, a low murmur of logistics and arrangements. The house was filling with people, their shoes damp on the mahogany floors, their faces a gallery of practiced sorrow. I was supposed to be the grieving widow, the quiet rock of the Prescott family, but all I felt was a profound and unsettling numbness. I ran my finger over the dust on a sepia-toned portrait of Arthur and me on our wedding day. His smile was so open, so honest. It was a face incapable of deceit, or so I had believed my entire life. It was during the peak of the wake, as I was accepting a plate with a sandwich I had no intention of eating, that Father Michael made his way through the crowd. He has been our priest for 40 years, a man whose hands have christened my children and blessed my marriage. His face, usually so serene, was etched with a terrible conflict. He took my hand, his own rough and dry, and pressed a small, yellowed envelope into my palm. "Arthur made me promise," he whispered, his voice so low. I barely heard it over the drone of condolences. "Read it when you're alone, and may God protect you." That was the bomb. A simple envelope that felt heavier than a tombstone, and a warning that turned my grief into a cold, sharp dread. I slipped the envelope into the pocket of my dress, the crisp paper a secret fire against my skin. For the next hour, I was a ghost at my own husband's wake. I nodded. I accepted hugs that felt like cages, and I listened to people share memories of a man I suddenly felt I didn't know at all. Every word of comfort from my children felt like a performance. Susan fussed over me, trying to get me to drink some tea, her brow furrowed with what I had always taken for love. Now, I saw only a mask. Was her overprotectiveness a cage she'd built around me? Robert stood by the fireplace, talking quietly with his uncle. He was the practical one, the lawyer who dealt in facts and evidence. He had always been more distant than Susan, a trait I'd attributed to his demanding career. But now his distance felt like a wall, a deliberate separation. Was he fleeing a guilt he couldn't face? My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of black wool. The scent of lilies was cloying, suffocating. I had to get away. I had to read that letter. I watched Susan adjust a flower in a vase, her movements precise and controlled. She had her father's hands, but my sense of order. She always knew where everything was, managed all of Arthur's appointments, and kept track of their finances in his final years because, as she said, Dad gets confused. I had been grateful for her help, seeing it as the devotion of a loving daughter. Now that same efficiency seemed sinister, a calculated control over every aspect of our lives. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp New England air seeping through the old window frames. Finally, feigning exhaustion, I excused myself. "I just need to rest for a moment," I murmured to Susan, avoiding her searching eyes. Her hand on my arm was meant to be supportive, but it felt like a brand. "Of course, Mom. Do you need anything?" Her voice was soft, caring, perfect. It was the voice of a stranger. I shook my head and made my way towards the grand staircase, each step a monumental effort. The weight in my pocket seemed to pull me down, and I still didn't know that what was inside it would shatter everything I held dear. The journey up the stairs felt like a pilgrimage into enemy territory. The familiar creak of the third step, the worn spot on the banister where Arthur always rested his hand. These details of a shared life now felt like artifacts from a lie. My bedroom was my sanctuary, but as I closed the heavy oak door behind me, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was accusatory. It was the sound of 55 years of secrets I never knew existed. My hands trembled so violently I could barely retrieve the envelope from my pocket. I sat on the edge of our bed, the quilt. My grandmother had made pressing into the backs of my knees. The envelope was cheap, yellowed with age, and addressed to "My Evelyn" in Arthur's familiar spidery script, though it was weaker than I'd ever seen it. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just a letter. It was a final confession, a last will and testament of his fear. The glue on the flap was brittle, and it came apart with a soft, tearing sound that seemed to echo in the cavernous silence of the room. The single sheet of paper inside was filled with just 3 sentences. 3 sentences that took the foundation of my world and turned it to dust. "My love, forgive my silence. It was to protect you. Trust no one, not even our children." I read the words once, twice, a dozen times. The ink was slightly blurred, as if a tear had fallen on it as he wrote. The pain of losing him, which had been a dull, heavy ache, was instantly replaced by the sharp, cold poison of suspicion. The man I had shared my body, my dreams, and my life with was afraid. He was afraid of his own family. I looked up from the letter at the gallery of photographs on my dresser. There was Robert, beaming in his university graduation gown. There was Susan on her wedding day, me adjusting her veil, both of us smiling. There was a family portrait from last Christmas, all of us gathered around the fireplace, the picture of New England contentment. It was all a lie, a beautifully constructed, lifelong lie. The air in the room grew thin, and I had to place a hand on my chest to steady my own frantic heartbeat. A floorboard creaked downstairs. It was Robert's heavy tread, a sound as familiar to me as the rain on the roof. He was a good son, wasn't he? He sent money. He visited on holidays. He always asked about the orchids in the greenhouse. But Arthur's words echoed in my mind, a relentless, terrifying chant. Trust no one. What could my quiet, unassuming husband, a man whose greatest thrill was a fishing trip to Lake Winnipesaukee, have possibly discovered that would make him fear his own children? I folded the letter carefully, the creases sharp as a knife's edge, and tucked it into the drawer of my nightstand, beneath a stack of handkerchiefs embroidered with my initials. It felt like burying the truth, but I needed it hidden. I needed to go back downstairs and face them, to look into the eyes of my son and daughter, and see if I could find a flicker of the monster Arthur had warned me about. The thought sent a tremor of fear through me, but it was quickly followed by a cold, hard resolve. I would not let his last wish be in vain. My reflection in the dark window glass startled me. The woman staring back was not the gentle, submissive Evelyn everyone knew. Her eyes were wide, not with grief, but with a fierce, burning question. The soft lines around her mouth were set in a grim, determined line. That woman, the devoted wife, had died this morning along with Arthur. In her place was someone else, a matriarch forged in the fires of betrayal, ready to tear down the walls of her own home to find the truth. I smoothed down my dress, took a deep, shaky breath, and opened the bedroom door. The murmur of the wake washed over me again, but now it sounded different. It was the buzz of a hornet's nest I had just unknowingly kicked. Every whispered conversation could be about me. Every sympathetic glance could be hiding a secret. I felt a strange sense of clarity amidst the chaos. My husband had given me one last task, one final purpose: to uncover the truth he was too afraid or too weak to reveal himself. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the answers were right here, under my own roof. I just hadn't realized that the search for them would become a battle for my own survival. Back in the parlor, the crowd had thinned slightly. Robert was standing by the window, looking out at the rain-soaked garden, his shoulders tense. He was on the phone, his voice low and clipped. "No, the timing is critical now. We have to proceed as planned." He hung up abruptly as he saw me approaching, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Mother," he said, his voice softening into a tone of concern that now sounded utterly false. "You should be resting. This is too much for you." His words were a warning, a clear signal to retreat, but I heard them as a challenge. I met his gaze directly, searching for any sign of deception. "I'm stronger than you think, Robert." My voice was steady, betraying none of the turmoil raging inside me. For the first time, I noticed the subtle tick in his jaw, a tightening I'd always dismissed as stress from his job. Now it looked like a crack in his carefully constructed facade. What plan was he talking about? What timing had become so critical now that his father was dead? The questions multiplied, each one another brick in the wall rising between us. Susan appeared at my elbow with a cup of tea, her face a perfect mask of daughterly devotion. "Here, Mom, drink this. You're looking so pale." She tried to guide me to a chair, her touch gentle but firm. I pulled my arm away, a small, defiant gesture that surprised us both. "I'm fine, Susan," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second. A flicker of something. Was it surprise? Or was it annoyance? The loving, overprotective daughter suddenly seemed like a warden, and I, her prisoner. I spent the rest of the afternoon observing them, my children, these two, strangers who had grown up in my home. I watched how they interacted, the quick, meaningful glances they exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking. I listened to their conversations, now laced with a hidden meaning I was desperate to decipher. They spoke of paperwork and the estate, but their words were vague, their tones urgent. They were plotting something, moving pieces on a board I was only just beginning to realize existed. Later, after the last of the guests had departed, leaving behind the scent of damp wool and wilting lilies, the three of us were left alone in the cavernous silence of the house. The rain had stopped, but the sky was a bruised purple, promising more storms to come. Susan began clearing away cups and plates with a brisk efficiency that set my teeth on edge. Robert stood by the fireplace, staring into the empty grate as if searching for answers in the ashes. The air was thick with unspoken words, heavy with the weight of Arthur's letter hidden upstairs. "We need to talk about the future, Mother," Robert finally said, turning to face me. His voice was calm, reasonable, the voice he likely used to disarm juries. "This house is too much for you to manage alone. Susan and I have been discussing options. There's a very lovely assisted living community just outside of town, the Willows. We think it would be for the best." The words hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just suggestions, they were a verdict. My husband had been dead for less than a day, and they were already trying to remove me from my home. I looked from Robert's impassive face to Susan's, who was nodding in agreement, her expression one of pitying concern. "It's for your own good, Mom," she added softly. "We're just worried about you being here all by yourself." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Arthur's warning, Robert's phone call, their coordinated, gentle pressure. This wasn't about my well-being. It was an eviction notice wrapped in the language of love. They wanted me out of the way. But why? What was in this house that they so desperately needed to control? I sank into Arthur's worn leather armchair, the cool material a poor substitute for his presence. The room, my home of 5 decades, suddenly felt alien and hostile. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch me with accusing eyes. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a countdown to my own disposal. They stood before me, my own flesh and blood, waiting for my compliance, for the gentle, agreeable Evelyn to nod and acquiesce to their plan. But the woman in this chair was no longer that person. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in my chest, but it was now surrounded by a cold, sharp-edged fury. They had underestimated me. They had always seen me as the quiet wife, the doting mother, a decorative piece of furniture in the background of their lives. They had no idea what Arthur had left me, not in his will, but in that terrifying 3-sentence letter. I was alone, cornered and grieving, but I was not defeated. I was a cornered animal, and I was about to learn just how sharp my own teeth were. My own children's faces swam before me, their features blurred by a sudden hot wave of tears I refused to shed. The Willows, Robert had called it. The name was so gentle, so pastoral, a perfect ribbon on a box full of poison. I felt the worn leather of Arthur's chair beneath my fingertips, a last vestige of a life that was being systematically dismantled around me. They saw my silence as acquiescence, the weary surrender of a grieving old woman. They had no idea it was the calm before a storm I was only just learning how to summon. I gave a slow, deliberate nod, letting my shoulders slump. "Perhaps you're right," I whispered, my voice a fragile, papery thing. "I am so very tired." The relief that washed over their faces was immediate and sickening. Susan rushed to my side, patting my hand with that cloying, manufactured sympathy. "Oh, Mom, it's for the best. You won't have to worry about a thing." Robert, ever the pragmatist, added, "I'll have my assistant draw up the preliminary paperwork tomorrow. We can tour the facility later this week." They were so efficient, so certain. They moved around the room, speaking in low, decisive tones about selling the house, sorting through belongings, a lifetime of memories reduced to a checklist. I was no longer a person to them. I was a problem to be managed, an estate to be settled. I allowed them to lead me upstairs, my steps intentionally slow and unsteady. I leaned on Susan's arm, playing the part of the frail matriarch they so desperately needed me to be. Every touch felt like a violation, every whispered word of comfort a lie. In the sanctuary of my bedroom, they tucked me into bed as if I were a child, the scent of Susan's lavender perfume lingering in the air like a sweet anesthetic. "We'll handle everything, Mom. You just rest," she said, closing the door softly behind her. The click of the latch was the sound of a cell door locking. But they had made a critical error. They had locked me in with my anger. For hours, I lay perfectly still in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the house, the groan of the pipes, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the creak of floorboards as my children moved about downstairs, finalizing their plans for my future. Grief was a cold stone in my gut, but Arthur's warning was a fire in my veins. Trust no one. He had known this was coming. He had seen the vultures circling long before I had. What had he seen? What had they done that was so terrible he had to write those words from what was essentially his deathbed? The question was a physical ache, a pressure behind my eyes that demanded an answer. My mind raced, sifting through the last few years. Arthur's increasing confusion, which we'd all chalked up to his medication and his failing heart. Susan's ever-present help, taking over. Their finances, paying their bills, organizing his doctor's appointments. "It's just easier this way, Dad," she would say with a bright smile. Robert's infrequent but pointed visits, always asking about the value of the house, the state of the antiques, cloaking his avarice in casual conversation. I had seen it all as love, as concern. Now, I saw it as a meticulously executed campaign, a slow, patient siege on my life. I knew I couldn't find answers in the open. Robert was a lawyer. He would have ensured any obvious paper trail was scrubbed clean. He had probably already been through Arthur's study, his desk, his files, under the guise of getting his affairs in order. I needed to look where they wouldn't. I needed to think like Arthur. He was a man of simple habits and hidden depths. He wasn't a man for safes or complex passwords. His secrets would be kept in a place that was sentimental to him, a place that would seem like junk to anyone else. The thought struck me with the force of a lightning bolt. His tackle box, the old dented metal case he'd had since he was a boy, the one he took on every fishing trip to Lake Winnipesaukee. It was stored in the attic, covered in a half-inch of dust, filled with rusted lures and tangled fishing line. Robert would never have looked in there. To him, it was just the worthless remnant of a dead man's hobby. But to Arthur, that box was a sacred repository of quiet moments and private thoughts. If he had something to hide, something truly important, he would hide it there. I waited until the house fell into a deep, profound silence, sometime after 2 a.m. The rain had started again, a soft, persistent drumming on the roof that masked the sound of my movements. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet cold on the wide plank wood floors. Every creak of the house was a thunderclap in my ears. I moved like a thief through my own home, my heart hammering against my ribs. The attic stairs were steep and narrow, and I pulled the cord with a trembling hand, the folding ladder descending with a groan of protest that made me freeze, listening for any sign that I had woken them. The air in the attic was cold and smelled of cedar, dust, and forgotten time. A single bare bulb cast long, dancing shadows across a landscape of my life, packed away in boxes and draped in white sheets. There, in a far corner, behind a stack of old National Geographic magazines, was the tackle box. It was exactly as I remembered, olive green, with the paint chipped at the corners and a faint, lingering scent of lake water and earthworms. My fingers, clumsy with a mixture of fear and anticipation, fumbled with the rusted latch. It clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo in the silent space. The top tray was a chaotic jumble of colorful lures, sharp hooks, and lead weights, just as it should be. I lifted it out carefully, my breath held tight in my chest. Beneath it, nestled in a tangle of nylon fishing line, was something that did not belong. It wasn't a lure or a sinker. It was a small brass key, tarnished with age, tied with a piece of faded red twine to a small folded piece of paper. My hands shook so violently I could barely pick it up. The paper was brittle, and I unfolded it under the dim light of the single bulb. It held a simple 5-digit number written in Arthur's familiar script, 31782. It meant nothing to me, but the key was not for any lock in our house. It was small, ornate, and had the name of a bank engraved on it, one I barely recognized, Portsmouth Savings and Trust, a small local institution that had been bought out by a larger bank years ago. A safe deposit box. Arthur had a secret safe deposit box. My mind reeled. Why would Arthur, a man who kept all his official documents in the filing cabinet in his study, need a secret box at a different bank? The one they had shared, the one Susan had access to, was at the main bank downtown. This was something else entirely. This was his last line of defense. This was the secret he had died to protect. The secret he was now entrusting to me. The weight of it felt immense, a responsibility that was both terrifying and electrifying. I sat there on the dusty floor of the attic, the cold seeping into my bones, and I understood everything. The letter, the warning, the rush to put me in a home. They weren't just after the house or the money in the main accounts. They were after whatever was in that box. Or perhaps they were terrified of what was in it. They were trying to erase me, to neutralize me before I could find this key, before I could uncover the truth of what they had done to their own father. A cold, hard clarity washed over me, displacing the grief and fear. I was no longer a victim in this story. I was a protagonist. Arthur hadn't left me defenseless. He had left me a map. This key was the first step on a journey he couldn't complete himself. He had trusted me to finish it for him. The doubt that had plagued me, the fear that I was just a foolish old woman chasing shadows, evaporated. The evidence was here, cold and solid in my hand. I knew what I had to do, and I knew it would be the most dangerous thing I had ever done. I had to get to that bank, and I had to do it without my children knowing. They watched me like hawks, monitoring my calls, my appointments, my every move. Getting out of the house alone would be nearly impossible. They would see it as a sign of confusion, of an old woman wandering off, further proof that I needed to be cared for at the Willows. I would have to use their perception of me as a weapon against them. I crept back down the stairs, the key now tucked safely in the pocket of my nightgown, its sharp edges pressing into my skin. It was a constant, physical reminder of my new purpose. I slipped back into bed just as the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the window, painting the room in shades of ash. I felt no desire for sleep. My mind was already at work, constructing a plan, a performance worthy of the greatest stage. I would be the confused, grieving widow they expected. I would be compliant. I would be weak. I would let Robert make his calls and Susan make her arrangements. I would agree to tour the Willows. I would play their game by their rules, right up until the moment I broke them all. The next day would be a performance. I would feign a sudden need for a specific type of herbal tea from a small, old-fashioned apothecary downtown. One I knew was just 2 blocks from the bank building. It was a flimsy excuse, but my confusion would be the perfect cover for its randomness. My children believed they were in control. They thought they had won, that their inheritance was secure and their secret, whatever it was safe. They believed their mother was a relic, a ghost already fading from the world. But as I lay there, watching the sun rise over the slate roofs of Portsmouth, I felt more alive than I had in years. The grief for Arthur was still a part of me, but now it was forged into something new, a weapon, and I was finally ready to wield it. I thought about the man I had married, the quiet fisherman who had seen a storm coming that I had been blind to. He had spent his last days not in peaceful surrender, but in a desperate, silent act of protection. He had written that letter, hidden that key, and placed all of his faith in me. The trust he had lost in his children, he had placed squarely on my shoulders. It was a heavy burden, but one I would carry with pride. I would not fail him. The house began to stir. I could hear the floorboards creaking in the hallway. Susan, always the first one up. I closed my eyes, composing my face into a mask of weary sorrow. The battle for my husband's legacy, and for my own future, was about to begin. They would come in with tea and sympathy, and I would accept it with a grateful, trembling hand. They would see a fragile old woman. They would not see the key in my pocket or the ice in my heart. I ran through the plan one more time. The apothecary, the feigned dizzy spell to get a moment alone, the short walk to the bank. It was fraught with risk. If they discovered what I was doing, they would lock me away so fast my feet wouldn't touch the ground. They would take away my freedom completely, using my actions as proof of my incompetence. But the risk of not knowing was far greater. The truth was in that box, and I would get to it, no matter the cost. My reflection in the darkened window pane caught my eye once more. The woman staring back was no longer just a grieving widow or a cornered matriarch. There was a new light in her eyes, a hardness around her mouth that hadn't been there before. She was a woman with a mission, an avenger acting on a message from beyond the grave. They had started this war when they underestimated their father. They would lose it when they underestimated their mother. I could almost hear Arthur's voice, a faint whisper on the morning air, not with a warning this time, but with a plea. Find it, Evelyn, for both of us. I closed my hand around the key in my pocket, the cold metal a promise against my warm skin. I will, my love, I whispered back to the empty room. I will. The turning point had passed. There was no going back now. I was no longer just defending my home. I was on the attack. The next morning, I began my performance. When Susan brought my breakfast tray, her face a mask of practiced concern, I made my hands tremble as I reached for the teacup. I let a little spill into the saucer, a perfect, calculated tremor of frailty. Oh dear, I murmured, looking up at her with what I hoped were lost, confused eyes. I'm just not myself today, am I? It was a small, deceptive act, the first step on a path I never imagined I'd have to walk. The lie felt slick and unnatural in my mouth, but the pity that bloomed in her eyes told me it had landed perfectly. I waited until Robert came into the room, his briefcase in hand, ready to head back to his Boston office. He was the one I needed to convince. "Robert, dear," I began, my voice a quavering whisper. "There's a special chamomile blend that Dr. Matthews used to recommend for Arthur's nerves, from that little apothecary on Market Street, the old one. I think it might help me sleep." I watched his face for any flicker of suspicion, any sign that he saw through the charade. His eyes narrowed almost. Imperceptibly, the lawyer in him analyzing my request for loopholes. Susan immediately jumped in, her voice dripping with condescension. "Mom, I can get you any tea you want from the supermarket. You don't need to go all the way downtown for that." It was the first obstacle, the first test of my resolve. This was her control, her need to manage every detail of my life, disguised as helpfulness. I felt a flash of anger, but quickly suppressed it, letting my lower lip tremble instead. "But it's not the same," I insisted weakly. "It was Arthur's. It was the one that worked. I weaponized their father's memory, and I saw from the flicker of guilt in their eyes that it was a low but effective blow." Robert sighed, a sound of profound impatience. "Mother, it's not practical. Susan has appointments. I have to get to the city." He was dismissing me, treating me like a petulant child. The old Evelyn would have backed down, apologized for being a bother. But the new Evelyn, the one holding a cold, brass key in her pocket, held her ground. I let a single tear trace a path down my cheek. "Please," I whispered, hating myself for the display, but knowing it was necessary. "It's the only thing I've asked for." It was a gamble, pushing their narrative of the emotionally distraught widow to its limit. To my surprise, it worked. Robert exchanged a loaded glance with Susan, a silent communication that clearly said, "Just humor her. It's easier." He nodded curtly. "Fine. Susan will take you. But be quick about it. And Susan, don't let her overdo it." The permission felt less like a kindness and more like a parole officer granting a supervised outing. I had won the first battle, but the victory felt hollow and demeaning. I was learning that to fight them, I had to become someone I didn't respect, a master of the very deceit they practiced. The car ride downtown was suffocating. Susan kept up a relentless stream of cheerful chatter about the Willows, describing the garden club and the watercolor classes as if she were selling me a vacation package instead of a prison sentence. I stared out the window at the familiar gray stones of Portsmouth, the city of my entire life, feeling like a tourist on her last day. Each landmark, the bakery where I bought Arthur's favorite scones, the park where we'd walked the children, was a fresh stab of grief. I had to consciously force the memories away and focus on the cold, hard reality of my mission. We parked a block away from the apothecary. The drizzle had returned, casting a gray, glossy sheen on the cobblestones. As we walked, Susan held my arm in a grip that was less supportive and more proprietary, as if she were afraid I might bolt. "See, Mom? We'll be in and out in no time," she said, her voice bright and false. I could feel her impatience, her desire to get this chore over with so she could continue with the dismantling of my life. Inside me, a quiet, cold resolve was solidifying, pushing past the fear and the sorrow. This was not just for Arthur anymore. It was for me. The apothecary smelled of dried lavender, beeswax, and 100 different herbs, a scent that would normally have comforted me. Today, it only served to heighten my anxiety. I went through the motions, pretending to search for the specific tea blend, my eyes scanning the shelves of amber-colored bottles and neatly labeled drawers. I could feel Susan's eyes on my back, a constant, oppressive weight. This was my stage, and I had to deliver the performance of a lifetime. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat counting down the precious seconds I had. This was the moment. Taking a deep breath, I reached for a tin on a high shelf and let my handbag slip from my shoulder, spilling its contents across the worn wooden floor. "Oh, heavens!" I cried out, my voice genuinely shaky this time, as Susan bent down with an exasperated sigh to gather my lipstick and wallet. I pressed a hand to my forehead. "Oh, I feel a bit faint. All these smells, I just need a bit of air, dear. Just for a moment. I didn't wait for her permission, turning and shuffling towards the door like a woman on the verge of collapse. "Mom, wait," she called out, her voice sharp with annoyance. "I'll just pay for this. Don't go anywhere." The command hung in the air, but I was already outside. The cold, damp air, a shocking and welcome slap to my face. Freedom. For the first time in days, I was out from under their watchful eyes. The bank was 2 blocks down, a straight shot past a bookstore and a cafe. I pulled my coat tighter around myself and began to walk, my legs feeling both heavy as lead and light as air. Every step was a rebellion. The walk was an eternity. The faces of passers-by seemed to blur, their features indistinct. I was certain they could all see my guilt, my desperate secret mission. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. What if Susan came out and found me gone? What if she called Robert? The fear was a physical thing, a cold hand clutching at my throat, but I kept moving. The memory of Arthur's terrified script, "Trust no one," was the wind at my back, pushing me forward against the tide of my own terror. I finally reached the bank, my relief immediately soured by its appearance. The grand, old stone facade of the Portsmouth Savings and Trust was gone, replaced by the sterile glass and steel of a generic national bank. Inside, the warm mahogany and brass fixtures of my memory had been replaced. With cold marble floors and harsh fluorescent lighting, it felt alien, impersonal, and for a moment, my courage faltered. I was just a foolish old woman chasing a ghost in a place that no longer existed. This was a mistake. Clutching the old brass key in my pocket, I forced myself to walk to the counter. A young woman with bored eyes looked up from her computer screen. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone flat and disinterested. My voice came out as a croak. I need to access a safe deposit." "Ox." I slid the tarnished key onto the counter between us. She picked it up, turned it over in her fingers, and a look of complete confusion crossed her face. "I've never seen a key like this," she said, her suspicion palpable. "This isn't one of ours." My heart sank. It was over. I had failed. "It's from the old bank," I explained, my voice trembling with a mixture of real and feigned fragility. Portsmouth Savings and Trust. The name meant nothing to her. She sighed, a gust of teenage impatience, and called over a manager, an older woman with a severe haircut and a name tag that read Ms. Albright. I had to fight the urge to turn and run, to retreat back to the familiar prison of my home. The external conflict was no longer just my children. It was the indifferent, bureaucratic world. Ms. Albright examined the key with a professional, detached curiosity. "This is from the predecessor institution," she stated, her voice crisp. "The records are archived. This will take some time." Time was the one thing I did not have. I could picture Susan storming out of the apothecary, her face a thundercloud, scanning the street for me. I clasped my hands together to stop them from shaking. "Please," I urged. It's a family matter. It's very urgent." The manager gave me a long, searching look, and for a moment I thought she saw right through me, but then she simply nodded. "Wait here." The minutes that followed were the longest of my life. I stood by the counter, trying to look like a harmless old woman and not a conspirator about to uncover a terrible secret. Finally, Ms. Albright returned, a large, dusty ledger in her hands. She flipped through the pages, ran a finger down a column, and then looked up at me. "Box 31782. We still have it in the main vault. Follow me, Mrs. Prescott." Hearing my own name spoken in this cold, official place was a shock. It grounded me. It reminded me who I was and what I was fighting for. The vault was a cold, metallic tomb. The air still and heavy. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of Ms. Albright's keys and the heavy, satisfying clunk of the tumblers turning in the lock. She used her key, then inserted mine, and with a final turn, a small, rectangular metal door swung open. "The viewing rooms are to your left," she said, her duty done, before turning and leaving me alone in the echoing silence. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lift the box from its slot. I carried it to one of the small, wood-paneled rooms and closed the door behind me, the click of the latch giving me a small measure of security. The box was heavier than I expected. I sat down, placed it on the small desk, and for a long moment, I just stared at it. This was Arthur's final secret. Everything, the letter, the warning, the future of my life, was contained in this cold metal box. With a deep, shuddering breath, I lifted the lid. There was no treasure inside, no hidden cash or family jewels. It was filled with paper, stacks of bank statements held together with rubber bands, thin onion skin copies of legal documents, and a thick, sealed manila envelope with a single word written on the front in Arthur's hand. Evelyn. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal. Inside was another letter, several pages long this time, and a sheaf of financial reports from a company I'd never heard of, Prescott and Sons Development. I unfolded the letter first. Arthur's words filled the pages, a confession of his shame and powerlessness. He explained how, after his first major heart attack 5 years ago, Robert had convinced him to sign a broad power of attorney, claiming it was to simplify things. Susan, he wrote, had been the enforcer, managing his daily life, intercepting his mail, and carefully curating the information he received, all under the guise of protecting his health. They had isolated him, medicated him, and used his trust as a weapon against him. The financial statements told the rest of the story, a brutal narrative of greed and betrayal. Prescott and Sons Development was a shell corporation Robert had set up. Over 5 years, he and Susan had systematically siphoned money from Arthur's business accounts, transferring assets and leveraging his properties for loans that went directly into their own pockets. They hadn't just stolen from him, they had methodically bled him dry, leaving him a king in a castle with an empty treasury, all while smiling and fluffing his pillows. 5 final pages of Arthur's letter were the most devastating. He wrote of his dawning horror as he slowly began to understand the depth of their betrayal, his confusion lifting in moments of clarity. He described trying to confront them, only to be told he was mistaken, that his memory was failing, that he was becoming paranoid. They had gaslighted him, using his illness as a cage. The plan for the Willows, he wrote, was not for me. It had originally been for him. They were going to put him away, to gain full control, but his heart had given out before they could. I sat there in the silent, airless room. The papers spread out before me like the wreckage of a shipwreck. It was a cold, calculated, and monstrous betrayal. They had not simply been greedy children. They had been predators, slowly devouring their own father while he was still alive. The love I felt for them, the deep, instinctual love of a mother, curdled into something cold and hard and unrecognizable in my chest. It was the sound of my own heart breaking for the final time. A quiet knock on the door made me jump. "Ma'am, are you all right? You've been in there for nearly 20 minutes. It was Ms. Albright. 20 minutes. It felt like a lifetime. I quickly gathered the most damning documents, the power of attorney, the statements showing the largest transfers, and Arthur's final heartbreaking letter. I stuffed them deep into my handbag, under my wallet and handkerchiefs, leaving the rest in the box. I could come back for those later. This was the proof I needed. This was the weapon. When I walked out of the bank and into the weak afternoon light, the world looked different. The gray sky, the damp streets, the faces of strangers. Everything was sharper, clearer. The frail, confused woman who had entered the apothecary an hour ago was gone. She had died in that small, airless viewing room, surrounded by the evidence of her children's sins. The woman who walked down the street now was someone else entirely. She was not a victim. She was not a grieving widow. She was an executioner. Down the block, I saw her. Susan. She was pacing back and forth in front of the apothecary, her phone pressed to her ear, her face a mask of fury. She hadn't seen me yet. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old fear, the instinct to hide, to retreat, but it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by an icy calm. I straightened my shoulders, lifted my chin, and began to walk towards her. The weight in my handbag was no longer a burden. It was ballast. I was no longer drifting. I was finally in command of my own ship, and I was sailing it directly into the heart of the storm. Susan's face, contorted with a mixture of rage and panic, was the first thing that came into focus. "Where have you been?" she shrieked, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I've been calling you. I thought something had happened." The old Evelyn would have flinched, apologized, and allowed herself to be herded back into the car like a stray sheep. But I was not that woman anymore. I met her frantic gaze with a calm that felt utterly foreign and deeply powerful, a stillness I had borrowed from the eye of the storm I had just walked through. "I was delayed," I said, my voice even and low. "I had to visit your father." The lie was a test, and she failed it. The mention of Arthur didn't soften her. It only made her more agitated. "What are you talking about? Mom, you're not making any sense. We need to go home." She reached for my arm, her default gesture of control, but this time I stepped back, a small but definitive movement that stopped her cold. I held up my handbag, which felt as heavy and significant as a judge's gavel. "All the sense I will ever need is right here, Susan." Arthur left me a message, a very clear one. The color drained from her face, leaving behind a waxy, pale mask of dawning comprehension. The car ride back to the house was a masterclass in silence. The air was so thick with unspoken accusations and terrified questions that I could barely breathe. Susan gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her eyes fixed on the road. She didn't dare look at me. The drizzle on the windshield was the only sound, a somber, rhythmic ticking that felt like a clock counting down to the end of her world. I watched the familiar streets of Portsmouth pass by, no longer a prisoner being escorted home, but a queen returning to reclaim her castle. Every brick and cobblestone seemed to affirm my new reality. When we pulled into the driveway, Robert's car was already there. He must have broken every speed limit from Boston. He met us at the door, his face a thunderous mask of concern that I now recognized as pure, unadulterated fear. "Mother, what happened? Susan said you wandered off. Are you all right?" He tried to envelop me in a hug, the same suffocating gesture of false comfort I had endured for days. I placed a firm hand on his chest, stopping him. "I am perfectly fine, Robert," stated, my voice echoing slightly in the grand entryway. "But you two are not." I walked past them into the parlor, the room where they had sentenced me to a living death just the day before. The scent of lilies was finally fading, replaced by the clean, crisp air of a coming storm. I turned to face them as they followed me in, two accomplices about to hear their verdict. The contrast between the woman I was now and the woman I had been was a chasm they could not cross. The frail, grieving widow was gone, and in her place stood a matriarch made of iron and ice, forged in the fires of their betrayal. I sat down not in my usual chair, but in Arthur's worn leather armchair by the fireplace. It was a conscious claiming of power, of his legacy, and of his authority. From this throne of cracked leather and old memories, I looked at my children, these two strangers with familiar faces, and felt a profound and terrible pity. They were so blinded by their own greed, they never once considered the key woman they were trying to erase. They had underestimated me, and in doing so, they had sealed their own fate. Without a word, I opened my handbag and took out the first document. I placed the copy of the power of attorney on the polished mahogany coffee table between us. The silence stretched, thin and taut. Robert, the lawyer, recognized it instantly. A small muscle in his jaw began to twitch uncontrollably, the only outward sign of the panic raging within him. "A very powerful document," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "It gave you the power to simplify things for your father, and you did. You simplified his life savings right into your own accounts." Next, I laid out the bank statements from Prescott and Sons Development. I fanned them out like a winning hand of cards. The neat columns of figures, the dates of the transfers, the sheer, undeniable scale of their theft. Susan let out a small, choked sob and sank onto the sofa, her face buried in her hands. Robert remained, standing, his posture rigid, his face pale. He opened his mouth to speak, to formulate a defense, a denial, but no words came out. The evidence was absolute, a silent, damning chorus against him. Finally, I took out Arthur's letter. My hands were steady as I unfolded the pages. The sight of their father's handwriting seemed to break something in Robert. He finally collapsed into a chair opposite me, his bravado utterly gone. "He knew," I said, my voice softening with a wave of sorrow for the man they had destroyed. "He knew you were isolating him, gaslighting him, making him think he was losing his mind while you bled him dry. He was trapped, and he was terrified, not of dying, but of leaving me alone with you." I read them his final words from the letter, the ones about their plan to put him in the Willows. "They see me as a problem to be managed," I read, my voice thick with unshed tears. "And when I am gone, they will do the same to your mother. Protect her, Evelyn. Be the strength I no longer have." The room was utterly silent, save for Susan's ragged weeping. The full weight of their monstrous actions had finally landed, shattering the comfortable illusion of their own righteousness. They were not dutiful children. They were thieves and abusers. The external reaction was exactly what I expected, a complete and total collapse. Susan's tears were not of remorse, but of self-pity for being caught. Robert just stared at the floor, the brilliant legal mind reduced to a shamed, defeated shell. There was no apology, no plea for forgiveness. Their shock was not that they had done wrong, but that I, their quiet, docile mother, had been the one to uncover it. They were staring at me as if I were a ghost, a vengeful spirit Arthur had sent back to exact his revenge. And in that moment, I realized the full extent of my transformation. I felt no satisfaction in their defeat, no thrill of victory. All I felt was a vast, empty sadness for the family I had lost, for the children I had loved who had never really existed. But beneath the sadness was a foundation of unshakable strength. I was no longer defined by my role as a wife or a mother. I was simply Evelyn Prescott, a woman who had walked through hell and had not been consumed by the flames. "You will leave this house," I said, my voice ringing with an authority they had never heard from me before. "Tonight, you will pack a single bag each, and you will be gone before morning." Robert's head snapped up, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. "You can't just throw us out. We have rights." I met his gaze without flinching. "You have no rights here. This house, the assets you haven't yet managed to steal, they are all mine now. I spoke with my lawyer this afternoon. He will be in touch with you both regarding the criminal and civil proceedings that will follow." The threat of legal action, the language of his own world turned against him, was the final blow. He deflated completely. There would be no fight. They had lost. I watched them, my own flesh and blood, as they stood and moved towards the stairs like automatons, their faces etched with the ruin of their own making. The sight brought me no joy, only a grim sense of closure. I had honored Arthur's last wish. I had protected myself. I had taken back my life from the hands that had tried to steal it. After they were gone, the silence that descended on the house was different. It was not the hollow, grieving silence of the past few days. It was a clean, peaceful silence. A silence filled with possibility. I walked through the rooms of my home, touching the familiar objects, the cool marble of the mantelpiece, the soft velvet of the curtains. They were no longer just things. They were anchors, remnants of a life I could now choose to rebuild on my own terms. I went to the greenhouse, my true sanctuary. The air was warm and humid, thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming orchids. I ran my fingers over a delicate, velvety petal of a phalaenopsis, one of Arthur's favorites. It was here, among these quiet, resilient flowers, that I finally allowed myself to cry, not for the children I had lost, but for the husband I had loved, and for the woman I had been forced to become in his absence. They were tears of grief, yes, but also of gratitude for the strength I never knew I possessed. My reflection in the greenhouse glass showed a woman I barely recognized. The lines of sorrow around her eyes were still there, but they were joined by new lines of determination around her mouth. She was 78 years old, a widow, and utterly alone. But she was not broken. In fact, for the first time in a very long time, she felt entirely whole. The quiet, submissive wife had been a role she played, a costume she wore. The real Evelyn was the one who had just faced down her own children and won. I thought about the path I had traveled in just a few short days, from a grieving, disoriented widow to a strategic, determined warrior. I had been underestimated my entire life, seen as a gentle, unassuming presence in the background. My own children saw me as a relic, a piece of furniture to be moved and eventually discarded. They never imagined that beneath the quiet grace was a bedrock of New England granite. They never saw the fire behind my eyes. This journey was not just about uncovering a betrayal. It was about uncovering myself. I had to lose everything. My husband, my children, my trust in the world, to find the person I was meant to be. The pain of it was immense, a wound that would likely never fully heal. But the clarity it brought was a gift. I was the restorer of delicate, beautiful things. And now, I finally had the most important project of my life, the restoration of my own soul. The world outside my greenhouse was still gray and damp, but inside, surrounded by the vibrant, defiant life of my orchids, I felt a sense of profound peace. The conquest was not just in reclaiming my home or my finances. The true conquest was internal. It was the quiet, unshakable knowledge that I was strong enough to survive, strong enough to stand on my own, strong enough to write the final chapter of my story by myself. I realized that Arthur's last gift to me was not the warning, but the opportunity it provided. He forced me to open my eyes, to fight, to live. He had known the strength was in me all along, even when I did not. His trust in me, in his final moments, was the greatest. Testament to our 55 years of love. It was a love that transcended even the ultimate betrayal, a bond that death itself could not break. My hands, once skilled only with silk and thread, had now proven capable of dismantling a web of lies and deceit. They had held the key to the truth, and they had not trembled in the final reckoning. They were the hands of a survivor, and they were ready to get to work. I had a life to rebuild, a legacy to protect, and a garden to tend. The work would be hard, but I was no longer afraid of it. To anyone who has ever felt invisible, underestimated, or silenced, know this: the world may try to write you off, to place you in a box not of your own making. They may see your kindness as weakness and your silence as consent. But within you lies a strength you cannot possibly comprehend until the day you are forced to use it. Do not be afraid to find it. Do not be afraid to become the person you were always meant to be, even if it means tearing down the world you thought you knew. My story is not one of tragedy. It is one of rebirth. They tried to bury me, to confine my final years to a place of quiet forgetting. They saw me as a fragile flower, easily plucked and discarded. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They failed to realize that some flowers have roots of iron, and they had just planted me in the one place where, even in the darkness, I would not only survive, I would bloom.